Hi class, and welcome to this video in VCE Year 12 Economics, Unit 4 Outcome 1. And we're still focusing in this video on budgetary policy, but we're going to start to look at some more complex aspects of budgetary policy by covering three key knowledge points that cover the role of automatic and discretionary stabilizers. So we're going to have to learn what they are and understand how these things influence aggregate demand, stabilize the business cycle, and consider how these stabilizers influence government debt. So it's going to be a relatively long video because we're going to cover three key knowledge points that are all related. Now, if we look at these three key knowledge points, you can see that we are doing key knowledge points 6 to 8, all about these stabilizers, automatic and discretionary stabilizers. So it's going to have some assumed knowledge that you understand what a budget is, a budget deficit and surplus, how these are deficits and surplus are financed or utilized, and the relationship to debt. So you might want to watch a previous video if you're a bit unsure about previous key knowledge points. What do I hope that you get out of this video? You understand what an automatic stabilizer is, and we're going to talk about this in terms of a cyclical component of the budget, and understand how automatic stabilizers influence demand and stabilize the cycle. We're going to understand what a discretionary stabilizer is, and these are what we call a structural component of the budget, and again consider how they impact aggregate demand and stabilize the business cycle. And then we're going to consider how these two impact the relationship between budget outcomes and debt. But let's take a step back and think about what a government theoretically is trying to get out of a budget. So what is the relationship between the budget or fiscal policy and our goals? The first thing that we should remember is that the federal government should always be trying to maintain what we call a sustainable budgetary position or fiscal balance. This is because we know if we have lots and lots of deficits, we have to fund them by debt, which is going to create interest repayments. So fiscal balance refers to where we have a strong and sustainable financial position, where over time, we're going to balance out our budget surpluses and deficits. So we're going to start to have budget surpluses generated in the boom times, and this will be sufficient to pay for the budget deficits in the recessions or down times. And theoretically, this will mean that we don't have to have significant need to borrow or commit future generations to heavy debt repayments. So when I say balance, theoretically, a federal government should have a balance of surpluses and deficits. And if they do this, they should achieve their economic goals, but the government will have to make a decision whether they're going to go into a surplus or a deficit, because they are going to adopt expansionary or contractionary stances depending on what's happening in the economy. And if they do this effectively, adopt fiscal balances, effectively adopt deficits when needed, so expansionary policies, and surpluses, so contractionary policies, they should be able to achieve a sustainable economy which meets its goals of a strong growth, full employment, and low inflation. Now that's revision. Let's just have a quick, hopefully a bit more revision on what we mean by expansionary and contractionary, because I'm going to talk about these a lot. An expansionary budgetary policy is a budget that is going to be in deficit. So I'm going to write this word here so we remember. These are budgets that seek to, because of their deficit, so more spending than receipts, stimulate aggregate demand and economic activity. They're doing this because there is a slowdown, and hence they are expansionary budgets because they're trying to expand economic activity. They typically include reductions in receipts or rises in spending, and hence expansionary budgets are generally going to involve one of the following. They're going to involve an increase in the budget deficit, such as, for example, a rise in the budget deficit from 30 to 50 billion, or we might, maybe less obvious, might involve a cut in the budget surplus. such as a decrease in the surplus from 20 to 5 billion, even though we're having a budget surplus, we would say that this is more of an expansionary budget because they're spending more than they used to. And this is all about stimulating aggregate demand and economic activity. So expansionary budgets, generally deficits, used to stimulate aggregate demand and activity, and they do that by having more spending typically than receipts or a reduction in surpluses. Now, a contractionary budget, fiscal policy stance, is typically all about surpluses. These are budgets that are seeking to slow the growth of aggregate demand and economic activity. They're doing that. Why would we ever want to slow activity? It's because the economy is overheating and we have high inflation or inflationary threats. They typically involve rises in our receipts relative to expenses, hence the surplus. Therefore, contractionary budgets generally involve two things, either a reduction in the size of the budget deficit or a rise in the size of the budget surplus. So again, contractionary budgets all about reducing inflation, and hence to do that you must reduce aggregate demand and activity. And they're happy to do that because we know inflation is not a sustainable thing and it has risks and downsides from having too much inflation, and hence cutting spending and typically looking at economic budget surpluses. So here we come to start to think about what we mean by stabilizers. And here we're going to think about something that we haven't talked about before, the counter-cycle budgetary policy. As an economist or someone managing the economy, often instability or big highs and big lows are the enemy of a good economy. So to moderate instability and the business cycle, and if you remember, the business cycle looks like this with highs and lows, peaks and troughs, maybe even booms and recessions, a counter-cyclical budgetary policy needs to be applied to try and hopefully even it out. Make the highs not as high, but also the lows not as low. So we can use the budget to address that. And how do we do this? In a slowdown. So in those troughs, in those bottoming outs, a budget will often become progressively more expansionary to boost aggregate demand, to boost the GDP, to hopefully start to see it go up a little bit. And during strong inflationary upswings, so during peaks, the budget should become contractionary. So hence, as the cycle is experiencing peaks or good times, we will see surpluses. So it's counter-cyclical, and that's trying to drop the economy's economic activity. And if the economy is struggling, we're in a part of the business cycle like a trough where there is not much activity, using budgets to expand is what is used. And you can start to see this in this chart here. So how can we identify this? How can we define it? Typically, in a counter-cyclical budgetary policy, an expansionary stance, so to increase aggregate demand, occurs in a slowdown, and a contractionary stance, a deliberate attempt to slow aggregate demand, occurs in an upswing or inflationary upturn, thereby hopefully creating a stable economy. So what are these terms? What do we mean by automatic and discretionary stabilizers? And what is their role in stabilizing the business cycle? Essentially, for these budget outcomes to become more expansionary or contractionary, we must rely on stabilizers. So automatic stabilizers are also going to be called cyclical stabilizers, and discretionary stabilizers are going to be called structural stabilizers. They play a key role in stabilizing the business cycle. What do I mean by an automatic stabilizer? These are changes to the budget that occur without any deliberate government intervention and result in economic changes in economic activity. So these are things that are happening in the budget that occur automatically that stabilize it. So for example, parts of the budget that will create surpluses in good times and deficits in bad times. We hence call them cyclical stabilizers because the cyclical nature of the business cycle is impacting the budget. It's not a deliberate decision. What is an example? And we'll go through it in a bit more detail. For example, during low economic activity, where we were a counter cycle that stabilizes the business cycle would be trying to get a deficit, there will be less tax receipts and more payments due to welfare, hence creating a deficit. Now, discretionary stabilizers are deliberate policy decisions by government designed to change our receipts or expenses or outlays in an effort to influence the activity. Hence, we call them structural stabilizers because the actual structure of the budget has been altered to stabilize the business cycle. So something has deliberately been done, for example, in a peak to create more of a surplus, or in a trough to create a deficit, so more spending or less receipts to start to drive economic activity. So when we talk about automatic stabilizers, the thing to understand is that they operate in a counter-cyclical way to boost or slow economic activity. So for example, at a peak, these will start to influence a cyclical surplus, and they change as a result of the peaks in the troughs of the economic activity. So for example, this will cause the budget to gradually to move to a deficit in a slowdown. So in a slowdown here, you can see we're going to have a cyclical deficit here. Something in the budget automatically is creating this. And we're going to have more of a move to a surplus when we have booms and peaks like his. So what are some of the automatic stabilizers? And we'll talk about this a bit more. Most tax receipts are automatic stabilizers. And most expenses that include welfare benefits are also automatic. So these things are influenced because of the business cycle without any deliberate decision by government. So what is going to happen in an automatic stabilizer? What are the automatic stabilizers going to do during a slowdown? And remember, an automatic stabilizer in a slowdown is likely to try and drive an expansionary or deficit budget. So what is going to happen automatically to drive bigger deficits or deficits that drive economic activity? During a slowdown in economic activity, or at its worst, a recession, logically, the value of our tax is going to fall. Why would that happen? Weaker aggregate demand is going to have rising unemployment, less income tax because of that. People are going to be earning less, and some people are not going to be earning anything at all. They're going to have to pay, they'll pay tax. Companies will make less profits and pay less tax. And there'll be less sale of goods and services and hence less GST. So we're going to have less receipts. And expenses are going to increase. We're going to have to pay more welfare because of higher unemployment. And hence less receipts and more payments is going to create expansionary or deficit budgets. These automatically happen due to the business cycle, and this tends to have an expansionary effect. Deficits are going to have a impact where they're going to drive hopefully more household spending. Deficits increase the need for public debt and require interest payments, but these things are going to hopefully drive a little bit more economic activity. Now, if we have an upswing, their automatic stabilizers are going to automatically create contractionary or surplus budgets if there's no intervention by government. During a cyclical upswing, we are going to have more receipts because there's going to be more spending and sales, so more GST, more income and more profit, so more tax, so more company and income tax that dropped off. And some budgets' expenses will fall because there's going to be less welfare payments. So if we have more receipts and less payments, we are going to have a cyclical budget. Deficit is going to be reduced, and we might even move to a cyclical surplus. This can counteract this business cycle, and this surplus might actually slow the growth in the private sector due to C and I spending going down, drop economic activity a little bit because they are having more receipts and less outlays by the government, and we know the government drives a lot of economic activity. Now, the good thing about economic automatic stabilisers is they work fairly quickly and efficiently in theory. So these should happen pretty automatically, hence the term automatic stabiliser. Then we come to discretionary stabilisers. These are not automatic. We call them structural stabilisers, and these help change the budget, but these are deliberate changes to policy, the rules that are going to impact the budget receipts and outlays. For example, the government could change revenues, alter tax rates, alter the tax on profit, change GST, make a new tax, take away a tax. They could change their expenditure. They are in charge of almost all of the expenditure. So they can change the welfare rate, change the investment in education, defence, foreign aid. And all of these things are going to impact the deficit or surplus outcome. So theoretically, a government that is being economically responsible can make decisions, and if they realize that we are in an upswing in good times, they can make decisions to hopefully drive surpluses that are going to smooth out the peaks, and also recognize that then they can save that money and hopefully then allows them in the down times increase their spending to have deficits that are affordable. So these are changes that are going to affect the structural budget outcome. They're going to impact aggregate demand, and they're going to be deliberate decisions that are going to impact growth and jobs. Why would these be put into place? These are often introduced when automatic stabilisers have not been powerful enough to deal with recessions and booms and stabilise the business cycle themselves. Now, they should be removed and probably not used unless automatic stabilisers have been not effective, because it can be quite hard to change them afterwards. But that's what we mean by discretionary stabiliser. So in a slowdown, it is all about trying to use budget measures and discretionary budget measures to increase aggregate demand, increase activity, and this is often going to be driven by increasing your deficits. So during a slowdown, the Treasurer may announce tax cuts, so a reduction in the receipts, or rises in spending. And you can see that there are some examples here, like cuts in personal company tax, rising spending. Now these will increase, as we said, the structural budget deficit. This is an expansionary policy to deal with the slowdown that is designed to stimulate aggregate demand by increasing lots of the components of aggregate demand, such as consumption, investment, and government expenditure. It's important to recognize, why do we not do them unless needed? These are often difficult to remove. Everyone wants tax cuts and rises in spending, so it often can be quite hard to remove this, especially after the slowdown has finished. And we don't want permanent structural deficits. These are not necessarily sustainable. Now, why are they not sustainable? Because we know the deficit will increase public debt. This increases interest payments. And while it might appeal to voters, and there is often a bias towards it because voters want it, we know it might not necessarily be good economic management. Now, even less popular during an upswing is a government making deliberate decisions to reduce aggregate demand, reduce GDP, and hence potentially increase the surplus. So when an economy starts to recover, the Treasurer might do things like gradually withdraw or remove the discretionary stimuluses that during the slowdown. This might mean cuts in receipts. That might, reversing the cuts in receipts, so raising tax rates, or reducing spending. Now, this can be quite unpopular, but a responsible government would likely be doing this, making sure that they are stabilizing the business cycle and in an upswing, taking advantage of this and banking some surpluses. So what has been happening in the recent and in the future? We know in Australia that we have had significant deficits, and you can see in this chart, 2019 all the way to the proposed 2024, significant deficit. So the underlying left-hand side, significant deficits, because this is all deficits. Maxing out, and I know the numbers can flow around, over $200 billion in deficits throughout. Now, cyclical are your automatic stabilizers. So we can see in a downturns, in bad times, or in a poor business cycle, then there have been automatic things that have kicked in that have increased aggregate demand. However, governments have made deliberate decisions in 2019 and 2020 that they needed to further stimulate it. So these are things like your job keeper, job seeker, and other things that we will talk about in future videos, things like automatic asset write-offs and things like that, designed to stimulate the economy. Why were they doing that? Why did they do that in 2021 as well? Because the business cycle was in such a poor state. We were in a recession for the first time in almost 30 years. The government needed to make significant decisions to stimulate the economy. And you can see the plan is to remove those discretionary stabilizers. So what if we're to summarize it? There has been significant budget deficits in recent years, largely stemming from the government taking an expansionary fiscal approach due to COVID and the associated recession. This deficit was caused by automatic stabilizers, cyclical, so we'll write that here, automatic, but also a conscious decision by the government to apply discretionary stabilizers to try and really drive economic activity. This led to significant decreases in revenues and significant increases in expenses. And it's because the government realized these real troughs that we're experiencing needed to some budget intervention. So what are some of this, if we're to talk about it even more? Automatic stabilizers that have happened due to the recession and COVID worked relatively well. What were some of the things that happened? Workers learnt less money. Not a good thing. But within the budget, they paid less tax because their incomes fell. They actually reduced the tax received by the government, but reduced the tax burden on people, increasing disposable income, increasing activity because of it. Those that experienced significant income loss or unemployed received significant welfare or support repayments. This accounts for about 30% of the budget deficit. Because this was such a recession, such a shock to the economy, the government adopted significant discretionary stabilizers, things like JobKeeper, JobSeeker, personal tax cuts, business tax cuts, such as the instant asset write-off and accelerated depreciation. And they even brought forward some infrastructure spending. This was all designed to stimulate activity, give people jobs, give people money so they could spend and hopefully make the real recession not as big as it had to be. And this was a massive effort by the government and accounted to 70% of the budget deficits. And you can have a look here. This hopefully, in this case, limited a really big drop. So the government would say that instead of the recession being this low, they have potentially limited it. So This is what the reality, the potential was here. Now, what is the consequence of this? This means that we have had a significant increase in our debt. Significant debt. And you know, why has this potentially not been necessarily happening in a counter-cyclical way? We know that we have had budget deficits all the way back to 2009, which have significantly increased our debts. And we've talked about in a previous video the relationship between government budget outcomes and government debt. We know with deficits we have more debt, and there would be an argument that during a poor economy, a business cycle that was having troughs, which we've had since about 2010, you could argue that automatic stabilizers have helped expand the economy, help reduce those troughs, but the outcome has been a significant increase in government debt. Now, is that a poor negative thing? That's going to be all about the big things, big questions. Can the Australian country afford that debt? Probably. Have they used the deficits effectively? A question mark. Some people would say yes, some people would say no, but this is something to consider. Now with that, that's quite a long video, but I hope that's really given you a good understanding of the fact that the economy goes through cycles. And there's parts of the economy, which we call stabilizers, that smooth the peaks and troughs. And this is a desirable outcome. These are automatic stabilizers, automatic things that happen that influence aggregate demand in the cycle. So reducing demand in the peaks, increasing demand in the troughs, and discretionary stabilizers. These are structural, deliberate decisions by governments to do the same. And we understand that these are going to have an impact on government debt because higher deficits are going to be equal more debt, surpluses are going to equal less debt, and these stabilizers are driving these budget outcomes. I hope you've enjoyed and understood this video. It's quite complicated stuff, but I hope this has helped you understand fiscal policy a little bit more.